As some of you may have noticed, I've been covering more and more stories having to do with crime on the show that's been taking place over the last year. Some allege that this is a sign of some sort of right-wing pivot. Others think it's a grift. A few have actually reached out to me privately, of course, to thank me for shedding light on these issues because it's affected them. Many of these people are workers who have dealt with kind of terrifying smash and grab incidents where individuals were armed. Others feel that their quality of life has been decimated as a result of rising crime in their communities. And many of these individuals happen to come from majority minority communities. But the tide seems to be shifting because while I felt alone on this issue on the left for quite some time now, I think more and more people on the left, including progressives, are feeling comfortable speaking out and kind of shedding light on this and kind of demanding that the Democratic Party take this issue a little more seriously. One of those individuals is Paul Shofield, who recently wrote an opinion piece in the Washington Post titled, "Liberals Shouldn't Scoff at People's Fears of Homelessness and Crime." And in it, he makes several arguments that I've been at least trying to articulate on the show. Maybe I wasn't as good as doing so, but here are a few examples of what I'm talking about. He writes that as a political philosopher who studies homelessness and considers himself progressive, I found little to celebrate in this episode of culture war point scoring. By glibly dismissing people's feelings about open air drug use, shoplifting, and human waste on the streets, liberals empower their ideological opponents. Many cities around the United States with significant homeless populations also have large numbers of low-income renters, people of color, and immigrants. Because these groups are less likely to have resources to buy their way out of a troubled neighborhood, they end up being the people whose kids are harassed by people under the influence of drugs on the way to school, the ones whose doorsteps are defecated on, and the ones whose sidewalks are made impassable by tents and trash. And finally, he writes, they are the ones whose stores close early to avoid being stolen from and whose eateries move to the other side of town. To shrug this off or to dismiss it as mere conservative propaganda is profoundly unprogressive. Luckily, today we have Paul Shofield here with us. He's kind enough to spend some time with us to talk about this issue. He's an associate professor of philosophy at Bates College. He specializes in moral theory and political philosophy, and he has written many pieces arguing for things like the necessity of guaranteed housing. So he doesn't just say he's progressive, he's definitely proven it in the work that he has published. So Paul, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thanks for having me here.
So let's start off with the title of your piece. Why do you feel that liberals are scoffing at people who are fearful due to the rise in crime and homelessness?
Well, I sort of began the op-ed by talking about this segment that Fox News did, where they went around and interviewed progressives on the street of Seattle, asking how they felt about their living in a progressive hellscape. And the response they got was a bunch of individual progressives saying, "What problems are you talking about? What trash? I don't see any problems here. I see laughing and singing and dancing." Then said the reporter said something about somebody shooting up around the corner, and somebody said, "Oh, is that hurting you so bad?" And so it's this sort of thing. I see it quite a bit on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it. This attitude that if you bring up these worries at all, if you comment on the thing that's happening right around the corner or right behind you, you're in some sense not progressive, liberal. You're a reactionary, and I've begun to really worry about this.
Yeah, I mean, look, I totally agree with you. I saw the segment that you're referring to. A friend of mine sent it to me, and to me, it was pretty clear that the residents of Seattle who were talking about these issues in a glib manner just didn't want to give Fox News a win. They didn't want to be part of Fox News's propaganda, and I certainly don't begrudge them for it. But aside from that, I do think that there is an issue of denialism to some extent, I think it might be generational, because I remember when I was growing up, kids who ended up having to grow up in communities where there was drug dealing on the corner and open drug use, they tend to not have such a great shot at life, right? They start at a deficit in life. And I remember that was one of the issues that politicians on a local level wanted to tackle. Now there seems to be this denial that that kind of environment is actually pretty destructive for the development and growth of children, that it's actually causing all sorts of problems within communities. You know, what people don't understand is when you don't feel safe in your own community, you're less likely to go outside. You're less likely to connect with other members of your neighborhood. You're less likely to exercise. You know, you live in fear. And that's not something that progressives should want to provide cover for. It's something that they should want to find solutions for. And so what do you think are some of the areas where progressives can improve on their policy proposals in dealing with this, rather than just kind of pretending like it's not a problem?
Well, yeah, I think one possibility is that outdoor camping should be limited to certain areas of the city. Now, I think it matters a whole lot. The details here matter, and whether your response is reactionary or progressive, you know, it's going to be in the details. But if you limit camping to a particular part of the city or certain blocks or part of the park, you can also set up toilets. You can set up shower stations. You can focus in on that area for outreach, which will be better for the people who were in the encampments to begin with. I think that would make a big difference, and I also think that doing that, and some cities are already beginning to do this, but I think the messaging there matters too. I think it matters that you say, well, we're working on this. We see that you are that your children are having to walk through piles of syringes on the way to school, and we're doing something about it right now. I think people will be much more patient if we if we acknowledge the situation that they're in. Another policy proposal, so when I was walking around the Tenderloin district in San Francisco, there's open air drug use everywhere. I think it makes sense to have safe or supervised injection sites where those are the places that you go if you have an addiction. And I think we should make treatment available there. I don't think that we should be arresting everyone and forcing them into jail, but I think it's reasonable to give them a place to go and say that if you're going to do this, you have to do it there.
I 1000% agree with you on that. In fact, when you look at models that have worked in other countries, Portugal is a good example. Yeah. Portugal, with their drug decriminalization, had the right model to begin with, but then they unfortunately pivoted to a model that ended up being disastrous. And it's the model that we're deploying right now as we speak. Originally, what Portugal did is they had safe injection sites that were specifically run by the government as opposed to nonprofits. And they would be, yes, it was a safe injection site, safe use site where they would be monitored and it would prevent people from dying, which is incredibly important. But they would also be nudged in the direction of rehabilitation and treatment so they can wean themselves off of this addiction. And it ended up being incredibly successful. Where it started to fail is where they cut funding for the program, and then they decided to offload the work to nonprofits, which, look, to be quite frank, here in Los Angeles, that's the model. And the nonprofits, I think, are padding their pockets with taxpayer money. And I don't just think it. You look at the finances of each nonprofit, that's all publicly available information. And I don't really think that there's any reason that a group of executives at a nonprofit should be making, in some cases, $500,000 a year combating homelessness and drug addiction. It's very clear to me that there's misuse of funds there. But once you have this system kind of controlled by the government and the objective is clear and it's to get people off these addictions, I think that it could be much more successful, and we're seeing it in Portugal. And I agree with you, I don't want to see people arrested for addiction. I think that's the wrong way to go. But I've always been in favor of, legalizing and regulating. And that means, look, if we're going to have rules pertaining to public intoxication, if I'm not a cigarette smoker, but let's say I were, I can't just willy-nilly smoke wherever I want to smoke. So why would it be acceptable for someone to smoke meth on the metro or the subway, which is a commonly, accepted behavior now in major cities like Los Angeles and New York? I want to move on a little bit though, because I try to avoid conflating the issue of homelessness with the crime wave. There's definitely some crossover, but I am curious what your thoughts are, because in your piece you do kind of like group it together. I want to ask you why you do that.
Yeah, I think there is somewhat of a danger there, but I think there's just an issue about general disorder, where yes, some of those people committing the crimes are unhoused, but then there are others who come into the neighborhood because they see it as a place where there is a lot of disorder, and they can just walk into a CVS and take what they want, and so I think I think part of what's gone on, especially in the Tenderloin. So I walked around for 7-8 days while I was out there. I spent a lot of time. I saw very, very few police officers at all. I saw tons of private security, no police officers. And it felt like it was a neighborhood that had just been abandoned. And so when you have that sort of thing going on, it's going to attract those who want to come in and do a smash and grab. And so that, I think that's the longer answer to why one might conflate these things.
Yeah, that is a good point. And as I mentioned, there is some crossover, but there are certainly individuals who are not unhoused going around causing chaos. We've covered many of those stories already, especially as it pertains to, these stores, convenience stores, the smash and grabs of jewelry stores. Businesses are shutting down as a result of that. People are losing their jobs. It's a really big problem. And in regard to what you wrote about the Tenderloin, I think it's important for me to share this with the audience. So you write that conservatives' claims about crime have been fact-checked and found to be somewhat misleading when the numbers are crunched, broken down, analyzed, and put into proper context. But after spending time in July doing research in San Francisco's Tenderloin district, the epicenter of the city's homelessness crisis in San Francisco, I find such nitpicking almost entirely academic. Agreed. And then you continue to write, regardless of who's exaggerating what and what the numbers technically do or do not show, city employees shoveled mounds of garbage off the sidewalks. Everything smelled like urine. Drug dealers operated in the open. And while I used to think that talk of stepping over bodies on the street was propagandistic exaggeration, I can report that I was indeed stepping over bodies. I experienced that last year. Someone had died of a drug overdose at the entrance of our building. And it was one of the most horrifying, traumatic things I've personally experienced. Yes, I guess I've lived a pretty privileged life, but I don't think anyone should have to experience that. And my heart absolutely broke. It was a young guy. He was probably in his 20s, and he was definitely dead. And this continues to happen every single day all across the country. And there's just this lack of urgency to grapple with it. And I think that there's this weird libertarian strain within the progressive movement that I can't really understand. I don't know where it comes from. But final question for you. What do you think fuels that?
I'm not exactly sure, but for some reason, there is as you say, this libertarian streak, and there's this thought that being in favor of or pro homeless person, an advocate for them involves suggesting that we should never interfere with them in any way. But I think that this ends up, there are the activists, but it also ends up affecting those who are not entirely attuned to the issue. So they see that there's going to be, some sort of, camp sweep in several weeks, and and those who are in the camp are going to be moved from one place to the other, and they think, well, if I'm an advocate for the homeless, I should be against this sort of thing. And part of what I'm trying to do is suggest that if you're that person, you should also be thinking about the ways in which both the encampments are affecting the people of color, the immigrants, the working people in the neighborhoods, but also thinking about whether or not your advocacy for allowing the unhoused population to do whatever it wants, whether it's really helping them at all. I've become increasingly dubious when considering that.
Paul, thank you so much for taking the time and being generous with us today. I love the conversation. I hope we can continue at some later date. Keep up the great work, and thank you again for coming on.
That'd be great. Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Thanks for watching. If you become a member, you get to watch all this ad-free, except for, of course, this ad. Still, hit the join button below.